Today I'm going to be ranking every single Souls game easiest to hardest from Demon Souls all the way to Elden Ring. And if you disagree, I don't care. Also, what's up Asmongold? Starting with the easiest game in the series by far in my opinion, we have Demon Souls. Now this could be because I didn't play it until the remake, which came out after I had played every other game already, but I still think after playing all of them through again that it's the easiest. The enemies can do some pretty punishing damage, but if you use the easy mode, a shield, magic, the dodge button, you shouldn't have too much trouble here. Obviously the bosses are the main reason for my answer here, but I think both magic and the Crescent Falchion make this game a breeze and allow you to pretty much skate through the entire game with minimal effort. I will admit that the first area can be pretty challenging when you don't know where you're going, but the rest of the areas and bosses are easy enough to make up for it. Since the majority of the bosses have a specific gimmick that make them easier once discovered, it's hard for me to rank this game any higher. And while it does include bosses like Flame Lurker and Old King Allant, they're still easier than any main boss in the rest of the series. And you could argue that the puzzles are a different kind of difficulty, but how hard is it really to figure out that you need the Storm Ruler or that you can use the Thief Ring on someone with a blindfold on? Demon Souls does have some difficult levels, but I think the order you progress them in can have an impact on your experience, which makes it tough to determine. But the only one I can guarantee you'll struggle with is the Valley of Defilement, and not for good reasons. A lot of people might argue that World Tenancy makes this game more difficult than some of the others, and while that may be a valid point, if you jump off the top ropes like Randy Orton in the Nexus, you won't have any trouble with it. Demon Souls is the easiest game in the series, no contest, let's move on. Moving on to our next spot, we have Dark Souls 1. While definitely a huge jump in difficulty from Demon Souls, I still think Dark Souls 1 is one of the easier games in the series, despite playing it pretty early on in my FromSoft journey. The main reason for this is the enemies. Most are pretty easy to parry or block if you need, and getting backstabs is super easy in this game. The level design can make it a little bit more challenging to navigate, since certain areas like the graveyard can make you want to throw yourself out the window, but don't give up, Skeleton. Merch linked in the pinned comment. But really, once again, the bosses are what made this game feel easier to me. Ornstein and Smo were the only boss that really gave me any trouble in this game, aside from the exception of maybe Artorias. But most of the main bosses in this game were pretty easy. The only real arguments for difficulty here are things like the clunkier rolls and the slow healing animations, but most of the bosses and enemies are pretty slow, so it doesn't end up being a huge deal. Which I think is what it comes down to, speed, which is why the first two games on this list happen to be the slowest in the series. A lot of what makes the Dark Souls games difficult comes down to reaction time and learning the patterns of enemies and bosses, which is a lot easier when it's slowed down. You have time to think about your next move or change your strategy without needing to try again as many times, and I think that's a huge factor. I will say this game doesn't have anything I consider to be super overpowered like in some of the other games, but all the weapons are viable, so creating a build isn't super mind-numbing. Overall, obviously this game is still tough and they clearly ramped up the difficulty from the first title, but it still comes in as the second easiest in the series for me. Coming in at the number 5 spot, we have Elden Ring. I had to think really hard about where to put this one, but I don't think it's super hard. And that's really for two reasons: the Spirit Ashes and the incredibly broken weapons. If you're playing this game with a normal weapon and no summons, I'd probably rank this a couple spots higher, but I gotta include everything the game makes available to you here. In addition to that, the open world aspect makes it to where you can pretty much run anywhere and get set up super quickly, meaning if you know where to go, you can make it as easy as you want. At least with all the other games on this list, there's not a ton you can do to cheat the system that much. I obviously have my own personal bias ranking Elden Ring this low because it was the last FromSoft game I played, meaning I already got good and knew the entire formula. But from the amount of people I know getting introduced to the series with this game specifically, I feel like a lot more of them stuck with it than they did with the Dark Souls games, so that's something. Or maybe it was just because it was more popular, but I'm still counting it. I will admit though, I was pretty surprised at the challenge this game did have, since I saw early gameplay of the Tree Sentinel and thought, oh, these guys are just trash, I'm gonna take them out off the bat, and then got humbled pretty quickly after getting the game. But the fact that you can leave pretty much any boss at any time and come back later when you're more powerful instantly makes this game one of the easiest for me, and I can't deny that. Weapons like Rivers of Blood and the Moonveil Katana basically make the experience a button pressing simulator, and if you add spirit summons on top of it, you could basically beat the game blindfolded. Oh wait, people actually did that. That's actually insanely impressive. FromSoft fans are crazy. But seriously, even with some of the toughest bosses in the series like Malekith and Millennia, I still think the tools the game gives you throughout the experience makes it much easier. Next up, I'll give you 1 second to subscribe before I say it, please, thank you. At number 4, we have Dark Souls 3. This one was really tough for me to rank since it was my first ever Souls game, so I'm always gonna remember it as way harder than it actually is. The main thing I struggled with was the bosses, especially in the DLC. I think it has some of the most difficult bosses in the series without anything too broken in the game to overpower them. But the reason it's still a bit lower is due to the rest of the game. The levels aren't super difficult to get through, and most of the enemies can be taken taken down by spamming one button. Most of the bosses in the first half of the game are pretty easy as well, especially with things like the amount of iframes you can get from your rolls and how quick you can use your healing items. It's also pretty easy to get overpowered level-wise in this game since it feels decently easy to get souls and it has some pretty solid farming spots as well. A lot of people consider this to be one of the easiest, but it's really hard for me to put it any lower with bosses like the Nameless King and the Soul of Cinder. Not to mention Freed and Midir in the DLC. But it also has fast travel unlocked from the beginning, a generous amount of checkpoints, almost too many checkpoints, actually way too many checkpoints. Where was this generosity in Dark Souls 2? Most of the areas are a breeze and are pretty easy to run through if needed. Parrying is much harder to pull off in this game, but backstabs are incredibly simple here, making the majority of enemies easy peasy. Especially if you use easy mode, I mean a shield here. But I think the combination of this game letting you get to crazy high levels with ease, tons of upgrade mats, fast rolls, and all kinds of buffs, it's easy enough to where you can get through it without much trouble. And overall, it still feels pretty balanced altogether, so I think the middle of the pack is a good spot for this game. Moving on to my top 3, this one might be unpopular, but I'm gonna go with Dark Souls 2. I didn't have a ton of trouble with many of the bosses in this game, but the levels were, well, you've seen the Shrine of Amana. Really, the unfortunate part about this is that most of the difficulty in Dark Souls 2 is not in a good way. I absolutely love this game, but I'd be insane not to admit its obvious flaws. Most of the challenges I faced in this game were due to huge mobs of enemies in random areas or crazy environmental hazards. The majority of the boss runs are harder than the bosses themselves, and if you don't realize the importance of the adaptability stat like I didn't, you're in for a rough time. The freedom this game gives you within the world does make it a bit easier since you have more options on where to go, but it's also incredibly easy to get over leveled in this game. A lot of enemies drop a good amount of souls and there are tons of good farming spots to get set up quickly. In addition, things like the bonfire aesthetic allow you to fight easier bosses multiple times, giving you tons of souls for minimal effort. But still, it takes a while for these strategies to become super significant, and even when you do get super over leveled, the game is still pretty tough. Personally, the hardest thing about this game for me is the way it feels when you get hit. It's not super impactful, so sometimes I won't even notice when I take damage. On top of that, your health bar is also halved in this game unless you use a ring or return to human form. This is a mechanic that I'm very glad was only present in 2 of the games. It makes everything a bit harder for obvious reasons. Stamina also feels very low, and for a game that has rolls that are already more difficult to pull off, you're gonna need all the help you can get. Blocking something with a shield takes like half your stamina bar, making it a lot harder to get the easy way out in some of the tougher fights. But with some of the artificial difficulty like the poison spitting statues in the Black Gulch and the snow in the frigid outskirts, I don't think I could put it any lower on the difficulty scale. Moving on to my runner-up, this one might surprise some people, but I'm gonna go with Sekiro. I think in a first-time playthrough, this might have been my number 1, but once I understood the combat mechanics a little better with some more practice, it actually got much easier for me. At this point, it's one of the easiest in the series for me, but it's hard to say because I fought every boss from the boss rush mode 1,000 times each, so it's hard to consider any of them difficult after that much practice. Yeah, I got good, but I'm trying to rank this more evenly and leave that out, so this game ranks higher. Every single boss took me so many tries in this game, even after the combat clicked, because I'd argue that this game is more about learning the patterns than any of the others. Dying in order to learn is even more necessary in this game to get all the movesets down, which inevitably makes this game harder. Some of the areas can get pretty tough, and fighting mobs of enemies in this game is super challenging, so you'll have to be a bit stealthy. Sekiro requires a lot more patience than the other titles, and I think this one was 10 times harder to get the hang of than any of the Souls games. They really stepped up the boss fights in this game as well, with the final one having a whopping 3 phases, 4 if you count Genichiro. In the beginning of this game, I thought the prosthetics would be an easy way to cheese my way through everything, since the firecrackers seemed to stun just about everything. Obviously, those became useless pretty quickly, and the only thing that really works is the umbrella, but even with that, it's probably easier just to fight normally. I think if you learn to utilize all the prosthetic tools available to you and upgrade them as you go, you'll have a much easier time, but at a certain point in the game, they all just kind of stop working. Sort of like how they just randomly stop letting you use Torrent in the last quarter of Elden Ring. But either way, I think this game is the hardest one to learn and improve at in just a single playthrough, giving it the number 2 spot in difficulty. And coming in at number 1, the hardest game in the Soulsborne series, we have Bloodborne. While I don't think Bloodborne is the hardest for any specific reason, I think it has the most consistent difficulty of all the games and will still give me trouble no matter how much I play it. Taking away shields is a huge reason for this because you really have no crutch in this game. I think this enhances the horror element to the game because you feel so vulnerable rounding a corner without being able to cover yourself. I will say that parrying is much easier, but you can't parry many of the bosses, rendering that feature pretty useless when it counts. The finite healing system also adds another layer of challenge in the beginning, beginning because it gives the player real stakes for dying. If you die, you don't get those heals back. This is more of an inconvenience than actual difficulty, but I still think it affects the early game. This game has tons of enemy mobs, lightning fast boss fights, and super complex level design. I still get lost in this game at least once every time I play it again and end up having to look up where to go. It's easy to get overwhelmed when fighting multiple enemies at once without having a shield, and I think they combated this well with the trick weapon system, but it's still pretty difficult. A lot of the enemies themselves are really tough as well, and the damage output in this game is insane. Obviously, the rally system counters this, incentivizing more aggressive combat, but I think that adds an additional layer of difficulty and fun. Deciding whether to go in for the extra hits to get some health back or retreat and heal is something you have to choose within a split second due to the speed of this game. Most of the enemies and bosses aren't staggered super easily like in Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, making it much more strategic, especially when dealing with multiple enemies. I think the Old Hunters DLC is probably the hardest DLC in the series overall. Even when I go into it over leveled, I'm still surprised at how punishing it is. And this was a tough list to make, and I know you're waiting for my outro, so I guess